And that means, of course, that we are live streaming for everyone. Let me welcome you to the third meeting of the Commission. Appreciate everyone's involvement and enthusiasm for this. It's going to be kind of a busy meeting, so we'll jump right in. Let me ask first if everyone's had a chance to look at the minutes for the September 21st meeting. And if so, if they're all right, will someone offer a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and second. Any discussion, reservation, revisions, anything like that? Hearing none, all those in favor? The minutes are approved. Let me also just add a comment. Some of those presentations were excellent. In fact, I'm still going through some of the data and some of the thoughts, but several of them were really well done. So I thank the presenters on that. Today we have a busy agenda. Kind of an overview, we have two major panels. One is what we call the Equity Stakeholders panel, and then the second is the Environment and Allied Stakeholders panel. It's a little unfortunate given how important these topics are that we're constrained, but we do have a session coming up and we want to be able to make some recommendations and all in plenty of time. So I appreciate everyone's cooperation. For the panelists, let me just remind you a couple of quick things. Each panel is slated for approximately 30 minutes of presentation time, and that will then give us some time for questions and answers from the commission members as well. The panelists will present in order to which they appear on the agenda, and with one exception, and that is that we have added at the end of the second panel, Chris Casera, representing the union for the Rangers as well. And then I would also ask in terms of the time, if we could just proceed by having the panelists introduce themselves when they get presenting, and that will save even just 30 seconds or so per panel from the presentations may be in there. So if you just move on through that as well. Before we begin the presentations, are there any particular questions or observations? And I would tell the public that a couple of our commission members working very, very hard must leave just a few minutes early to go to a very important second commission that they're working on as well. It's the life of legislators just before the session. And so if you see someone going off, please bear with them as well. Any quick observation or anything press before we jump into this? All right, seeing nothing, then we'll go ahead and start with the first presenter and move free flowing thereafter. Ms. Camille Burke, who is the chair of the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities. And Camille, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Just want to say that this subject, the State Park Investment Commission, it's a welcome commission. It's near and dear to my heart. I'm a native Baltimorean, but I used to be chief of recreation for Recreation and Parks. So I totally understand the importance of outdoor activity and equity. In my real life, I'm actually director of the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program for the Baltimore City Health Department. So needless to say, we're a little busy right now. However, the other life, I actually am the chair of what we call CJAC, the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities. Just want to give you a little bit about what we do. Also want to take this opportunity to extend an invitation for you all to join us, ask us questions, anything we can do to partner, we're more than happy to do that. You can go ahead to the next slide. Skip that one. Here it is, the role of what we call CJAC. We focus on examining environmental environmental justice issues, and ensuring sustainable communities. Our charge specifically is to analyze, review, and develop criterion for determining environmental impacts of current state laws and regulations and policies. We recommend options addressing EJ issues to the governor and the General Assembly. We look at the adequacy of current statutes, and we find areas in the state that require immediate attention. And there are always areas, let me say, that require immediate attention and/or action in regards to environmental justice. We work closely with the Children's Environmental Health Protection Advisory Council, CPAC. We also work closely, since we're kind of anchored at the Maryland Department of the Environment, with the Maryland Climate Change Commission and also the Office of Minority Health and Health Disparities. We have grown as of July last year to 23 members. It is an array and cornucopia of community members, business members, health experts, environmental activists, local government, and folk from affected communities. And we meet the fourth Tuesday of each month. We actually had our meeting change, so I'm actually going to leave this meeting and go right to that meeting, but this was so important, I actually pushed our meeting back just a smidge so I could present to you all. Next slide. So these are some of our accomplishments and initiatives this year. As I said before, we've grown. We were 12 members, we're now 23. This has been a rebuilding year for us with lots of renewed interest. We've met 7 times in 8 months. And as I've said before, we've grown our membership. We've actively participated in discussions with legislation and legislatures in both houses up through 9, 10, 12 o'clock at night, because we want to get it right. And it's important for the community that we get it right. We collaborate with the Maryland Climate Change, as I said, Commission, and we specifically want to add climate justice considerations to our work as well. We have spent a lot of time reviewing and utilizing mapping tools, especially tools that are public friendly, that they can use to look at their community, to figure out what's going on in their community as far as lead, asthma, greenhouse gases, things like that. We also developed a plan for community outreach tailored to the needs of the community. We recently took our show on the road and spent a day on the Eastern Shore looking at CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. I learned a lot doing that. We're going back to do a tour of Purdue to see what the other side of that looks like in a couple weeks as well. We had about 15, 20 members, and it was certainly eye-opening for me, who was a city girl, to look at where the food starts as opposed to where I buy it. And I said, as the implementation of Senate Bill 674, House Bill 1207 included that we specifically host 4 community listening sessions in communities. It's been a little difficult this year with COVID, but we literally have safely and socially distanced kind of taken our show on the road. Next slide. You all can reach out to me, Devin Dotson. I certainly want to give you a greeting from Secretary Grumbles, Deputy Secretary Horacio Tablada. We welcome partnership with other commissions, and certainly any input, and anytime we can help, we certainly want to. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to present. And I welcome any questions in this short time frame if you have any.
I think we're going to come back to the questions at the end of this panel. Is that correct?
Not a problem.
Is that
Right
correct?
behind me?
Andrew or Jeremy, is that the way we should do it?
Yes.
That was my recollection. All right, we're going to move immediately then into Maite, and she will move us along.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you to the members of the State Park Investment Commission and to Governor Glendenning for having me today. My name is Maite Arce. I am the founder and president CEO of Hispanic Access Foundation. And Camille, it's wonderful to learn about your organization and your important work. Really thrilled to share this space with you. Next slide, please. My organization, if you click, you'll see that we'll be clicking through some of these slides. Go ahead and click ahead. We elevate Latino voices to ensure equity and representation in all areas of life. And we elevate community voices to build a better nation for all. And we do our work in a way that's very unique. We work in developing the capacity of local leaders and networks and partners, and together we work to maximize the potential of our communities. And I'll pause here. My slides have some automation, and so I apologize. Go ahead and just, Jeremy, click on Latino Conservation Week. Yes, thank you. These are some of the initiatives that are that we work with in community, and they include the groundbreaking Latino Conservation Week, which gets people outdoors, in nature and in stewardship, as well as the Mono Project, which has provided more than 400 young professionals with paid internships and jobs in the natural resource field, as well as Latino Advocacy Week, which is annual, and in the spring builds familiarity and skills among leaders with the public policy process in local communities, states, and at the federal level. And then finally, one more click, we have Por la Creación, Faith-Based Alliance, which brings a trusted voice among Latinos in support of environmental justice and climate action. Next slide. Every year we publish a conservation policy toolkit, a guide on conservation issues and how they impact Latino communities. And our research and reports inform the field, informs decision makers, community, and provides that cohesion and in research for our community, as well as resources for our community to use. If you go forward, you'll see that there's a report that you may be interested in called the Nature Gap. Jeremy, please click one more time. Thank you. In states like Maryland and across the nation, most children of color lack parkland and green space to play. And historically, these children have been deprived of the benefits of nature that other children have had. Next slide. If you click forward a couple of times, inequitable access to nature is a problem. Imagine communities of color are 3 times more likely than white communities to live in nature-deprived places, and sadly that's created a loss of access to nature, more heat, floods, coastal risk, less exercise and recreation, more pollution, fewer economic opportunities, poor mental health, and then the severity of COVID-19. So imagine how protecting more lands, more waters, the watershed over in Maryland can really guarantee that every child in the state has the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of nature. Next slide. We need intentional planning and resources to create more close to home outdoor opportunities and protect areas that are important to the culture and heritage of communities, past and present. We need to deepen that consultation and participation with the communities who live here. We need to change hiring and workplace practices and work to overcome the nature gap among children by increasing educational and outreach programs. Next slide. Some of the issues I heard in the last meeting is that this summer parks reached capacity. Click forward a few more times. Funding challenges and resources. There are funding challenges and the need for resource planning. There's a rise in visitorship, and there's even consideration of a park reservation system. Next slide, please. The recommendations I have for you are really, it's very important to know the problem. A community survey, a study is important to understand the cause of the issues faced by Maryland's parks and Maryland's people. It's very important to know your audience, really understand our constituency. In addition to knowing the issues, it's important to know as much as possible about the demographics, the needs, and the aspirations of this constituency.
Ms. Arce, please take 1 minute to conclude.
Yes, and so just click through, please. Make sure that you integrate equity principles, and of course, designing a test pilot like a reservation system is going to require consultation, deep consultation, education, and outreach with the community. I look forward to collaborating with you, and thank you so much for inviting me today.
Thank you very much. And we will have discussion in a few moments after the last presentation for this panel. Rosalind, are you just ready to jump in?
Yes, good morning. We are. I think they're bringing up our PowerPoint. And we are local recreation and parks. So we just want to make a distinction that both local recreation and parks as well as state parks are on somewhat of a life support as far as funding is concerned. So it's not either or, it's both and. And I think we're bringing up our PowerPoint. Corey, are you bringing it up or?
Oh, I can. I'm sorry. I thought Andrew was doing it.
Oh, Andrew?
Just pulling it up right now.
Okay, great. Andrew, this doesn't count towards our minutes, does it?
It doesn't count. What's the title of your presentation again? I apologize.
It is, I believe, Maryland State Commission presentation, State Park Investment Commission presentation.
All right, let me get back to that one. Be there in a second. Thank you for your patience. And you want to perhaps maybe go through your introduction. I can continue to pull this up.
Sure, I'm Sen Johnson. I'm the Director of Recreation and Parks in Baltimore County, but I also serve as the co-chair for the JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force for the Academy of Parks and Recreation Professionals. And Corey?
And I'm Corey Jones. I work with Howard County's Department of Recreation and Parks, and I also serve as the Equity Officer for the Maryland Recreation and Parks Association, also known as MRPA.
So just underscoring again, it's both ends. So, and we want to preface our whole entire PowerPoint by saying that State Parks really does an amazing job with the funding that they currently have. And I'll turn it over to Corey to start.
So just a little bit about, and Andrew, you can go to the next slide. Maryland Recreation and Parks Association. And so our membership actually consists of all 24 jurisdictions, in addition to some local agencies as well. And so we really work with our membership to serve as a convener and advocate on really anything related to recreation, parks, and the leisure industry as a whole. We work with our membership to provide professional development and advocacy specifically related to parks, related to programming, whether that be recreation-based programming or in the parks, therapeutic recreation, and then training and education on a variety of different topics. Next slide, please. And so we have a couple of different recommendations when it comes to just how we're looking at our state parks and just how we move forward in regards to state parks. And so one of the first things is really looking at providing equitable access, right? And so we encourage this body to really look at the accessibility of our state parks. And that accessibility ranges from the proximity to bus routes, right? And so we're really looking at, for the most part, a vehicle is required in order to access state parks, and how much of our population does not have access to a vehicle. In addition to really looking at our entry fees, right? And so if you have a vehicle, obviously you can drive to a state park and there is an entry fee for that. But if you are walking or walk through a state park, there is no fee. And again, when we look at accessibility, if you are using any sort of mobility equipment, right, walking may not be as easy. And so again, that's going to be a hindrance to using state parks. And then when we look at the opportunities within the parks, most of the activities that are offered require a familiarity and experience, right? So if you traditionally have not had access to the equipment or the activities or what is being offered in our state parks, there is not a large opportunity to participate in its current offerings. Next slide.
So also underscoring this, during the Great Recession, Recreation and Parks in particular bore the brunt of the budget shortfalls. So we were also the last to really recover, and we're still trying to recover. And then enter COVID. So for based on Google's COVID mobility data, Google's COVID-19 mobility data, my apologies. The recreation industry was the largest industry to increase. So our parks and our recreation facilities were bursting at the seams. You also heard earlier that the state parks really had to shut down at some times. So they were bursting at the seams, but you also had a lot of new users. And so when you talk about DEI, you talk about removing the barriers. So one of the barriers would be the rules and regulations. You use state parks very differently than you use local parks. State parks have a theory of leave no trace, which means you will be hard pressed to find trash cans. Local parks have trash cans everywhere. So it's an education piece as well. And I think that's also a budget piece for state parks. Equipment and program offerings. If you go into a state park, you should have all the equipment that you need. I recently went in to play disc golf, and it was an education piece for me as a recreation and parks professional. I'm like, well, how do I know where the holes are? Okay, so I'm glad I brought my own discs. So you really have to do your research ahead of time in order to be prepared and prepped. So if you really want to remove barriers, it would be great if there was equipment that you could check out, a lending library for recreation opportunities. But also the state parks trails are separate from the local trails. So there's no real connection or continuity. And we found that throughout the state, it just really depends on the relationships that the state parks has with the local recreation and parks department. We think there's also a great opportunity to work with grassroots organizations such as Black Girls Hike, or a lot of the different affinity groups, in order to help maintain or support the diversity that's really going into the state parks and helping to remove barriers. And so if funding is a concern, a lot of these grassroots organizations can provide assistance free of charge, and they can bring their constituencies with them. Next.
Ms. Johnson, please take 1 minute to conclude.
And so last but not least, regaining the funding levels would be helpful. State parks are far behind many other state jurisdictions as far as funding is concerned. And then I think the residents have shown where their interests are during COVID, and their interests are definitely in parks and local open space. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. So Mr. Archer next.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. My name is Yen Michael Archer. I'm a doctoral student working with Dr. Jacoby Wilson at the University of Maryland School of Public Health within the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. And I am very, very proud to reiterate a lot of the points that have already been made, and also be here with some esteemed colleagues. While we wait for the slide to come up, and I can always share my own screen, Andrew, if that's easier. But while waiting for the slide to come up, I'll just give a brief land acknowledgement. We do our work here in College Park on the historic lands of the Piscataway people and the Nacotchtank people. And so I just want to pay my respect on behalf of our center and our university to the elders and ancestors of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank folks, and the land that we now occupy. Great. Yeah, so you can go ahead and go on to the second slide here. I don't know how much background on equity and justice I should give. For now, it probably suffice to say, in the context of what I'm working on, which is the Maryland Park Equity Mapper, and I'm working alongside Sandy Olek, who gave a talk on behalf of DNR, I think a couple weeks ago. Equity is in the name, the Park Equity Mapper, and what we're trying to achieve is creating opportunities and creating services and fixes, solutions for inequity, which is basically one side has easier access to some resource or some benefit or less exposure to some hazard than another side. And so if you're looking at the top right panel here, both of the children in the screen have a ladder, but notice that since the tree is bending a little bit closer to the child on the left, the ladder on the right needs to be a little bit higher, and that's what we're seeking to achieve when we talk about equity. Next slide. So creating equal access to opportunities in parks and other green spaces for all. That's how we're defining park equity. And you can go to the next slide there. Specifically coming at this from the School of Public Health perspective, there are at least 3 main buckets for why we need green space in our lives, all of us. The first on the left here, instauration, encouraging physical activity and social unity, social cohesion. In the middle, we've got restoration of mind, mostly when we're talking about stress recovery and mental health. And then finally, mitigation, reducing toxic exposure and exposure to toxic stressors. And all of this culminates in better health and better well-being for those who do have access to green space and parks. Next slide. And beyond health, of course, we're looking kind of holistically. So you have economic, ecologic, environmental, and sociological benefits as well. This image is showing an illustration of the urban heat island effect, wherein in the middle of the graphic, you can see that the city has the highest late afternoon temperature, and that's because of all the impervious surface, typically in urban areas and in cities. And as you go out to the rural side or farmland side, you get more vegetation, more green space, and those relative temperatures come down by comparison. We'll go to the next slide. So we developed this tool alongside Maryland DNR. Actually, Maryland DNR developed the tool years and years ago, and we came on board to help improve it, to allow users to explore barriers to green space access, some of which the colleagues before me mentioned, to explore vulnerable populations in the context of green space access, and provide kind of a quantitative ability to compare different areas to help set priorities and provide decision support. And then additionally, to provide further context as to how these areas that may have inequitable access to green space may also be overburdened by other environmental justice factors. And that's where we come in with our context layers. The bottom line is we kind of target the tool towards 2 audiences. For regulators, it's an ability to identify areas of park need, therefore providing decision support for prioritizing investments. And then for residents, it's an opportunity to document lived experiences and learn a little bit more about what's going on in your community with regards to park access. Next slide. So we came up with our final 9 factors based on a peer-reviewed literature search or literature review, and there are myriad kind of barriers. It's kind of shocking to really have them all out on the list, but there are tons of barriers to park access, whether it comes down to your race and ethnicity stemming from the legacies of racism and segregation in the United States, classism as well, household income, education status, your physical activity level is influenced by your park access. And so this is kind of a range of different issues. And from these, we were able to pull, based on available data sets, 9 of the factors that ultimately made it into our tool. And so you can go to the next slide to see those 9. So the final 9 factors are distance to a park, population density within your US Census block group, income, median income, proportion of the population that are non-white or BIPOC communities, linguistic isolation, percent all children, so younger than the age of 18, all minors, and then older adults, older than 64 years old. Walkability, just because you may be scoring pretty well on park distance, but if there's a 6-lane highway between you and that park, it might only be several dozen feet or yards away, but that highway is definitely going to impact whether or not you have access to it. And then access to public transportation, as I think Corey mentioned earlier. And the model for which we overlay these factors, park distance does have a lot to do with just whether or not there's a park in your area, has a lot to do with your general access, but it's not the only factor. So it does have a greater weighting in the model, but also too does the ethnic and racial makeup of that census block group be, again,
Mr. Archer,
Yes.
Please take 1 minute to conclude. I'm sorry.
Sure. Stemming from that historic racism and segregation, and then the rest of the factors are ranked equally. You can go to the next slide. And then talking about those context layers. So interest in park access also stems from an interest in environmental justice in general. So interest in food equity, in pollution burdens, environmental hazards, and interest in health infrastructure. You can overlay all of these factors on top of whether or not communities have access to parks using the tool. Go ahead to the next slide. Finally, we also have a climate and health equity mapper that's coming online and being further developed. And this will combine kind of the realms of both health, public health, and human mitigated or human caused climate change. And so I can provide more information on that in the questions for folks who are interested, but needless to say, this is also a huge factor in park access as we look to the future of park equity. I think I can wrap up there. Yeah, there's the link.
Thank you very much. If you could stand by for some questions from the commission as well.
Sure.
Next.
I think I'm next. Should I begin? Jeremy? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the commissioners and to Governor Glendening for inviting AARP to be a part of this conversation today. My name is Danielle Aragoni. I'm Director of Livable Communities here at AARP. I live in Virginia, but I've benefited from Maryland State Parks many times over the years and appreciate the investment and commitment to access that you all have historically had. You all know AARP. We are an organization of 38 million members advocating for older adults, and we're very much driven by the demographic changes that are confronting us, in which in just a few years from now, we will be comprised as a country of more people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. Next slide, please. And when we think about what that means for the communities that we live in and the degree to which communities are prepared for that change, we very quickly conclude that many communities are not, for some of the reasons that we talk about here in terms of housing and transportation. Next slide, please. But for purposes of today, I want to focus on parks. Obviously, there's a real lack of awareness in terms of how older adults use parks, but particularly during COVID and post-COVID. But we know pre-pandemic that older adults were not accessing parks to the degree that they, in a proportionate share that they represent as a population. 20% of park users, 4% of park users were older adults, were in communities where they represent 20% of the population. We know that those figures are skewed still further in communities of color, where parks are underrepresented and overcrowded, and that some of the heat effects that the prior speaker mentioned really have a particularly keen effect and acute effect on older adults related to the presence of the canopy in parks. Next slide, please. So what is it that we're doing about this and why does it matter? Well, we know that older adults want to be able to age in their community. About 3/4 of people 50 and above say they want to age in their community. And when thinking about what assets matter to them, 83% of older adults say that parks are extremely or very important to them in their choice of location. Next slide, please. And in particular, they're really looking for parks and park features that support both passive and active recreation. Older adults of today are increasingly very active. We have a longer lifespan than we've ever had before, but that doesn't eliminate the need for passive recreation, passive enjoyment as well. Increasingly, we see grandparents raising grandkids, so building and designing facilities that contemplate that familial arrangement is important. Older adults want to see universal design features baked throughout parks, and ASLA recently did some good work on that, which we contributed to. But really what we're looking for here is kind of a thoughtfulness that really encourages intergenerational use in all of our parks, both all ages, all abilities, all incomes. And that's really the sort of ethos that we bring to our parks work. Next slide, please. All of that is done under the guise of our Livable Communities approach, in which we run an age-friendly network, which now includes almost 600 communities committed to working on a multi-year basis to improve housing, transportation, and parks. Happy to say that 6 of those communities are in Maryland. We offer catalytic grants every year where we're demonstrating innovative approaches to parks and placemaking. We've awarded nearly $10 million over the last 5 years to 800 grants all across the country, including more than a dozen throughout Maryland. We do have a state office in every state, and our AARP Maryland state office is a partner to you all, can be a partner to you all, and is very much interested in and promoting parks-related work, which I'll get to in just a minute. Next slide, please. We have several tools that point people to age-friendly solutions, as we like to call them, including our livability index, which includes access to parks as one metric, as well as a number of publications. Next slide, please. Really, we're trying to reach local leaders. Please keep clicking through. There's a few bullets here. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. We're trying to reach local leaders to help them think differently about parks. So one of our publications is creating parks and public spaces for people of all ages, which includes worksheets and surveys and checklists to help local leaders evaluate the degree which their parks are meeting those expectations that we as older adults have. In addition, we focused a little bit more on how to address homelessness in parks and what it looks like to have winter placemaking activities and keep public spaces and parks active for our northernmost states. Next slide, please. Please continue to click through. There's a couple bullets there. There we go. Thank you. Our notion of parks goes beyond park gates. It also includes our public spaces, our plazas, our parking lots, our streets, our sidewalks. But the same ethos really applies in that we very much are keen on promoting walkability, ensuring that it is safe and accessible to walk or roll through public spaces, to activate them in ways that engage people and are enticing and interesting and multi-generational by design. And really the key of all of our work and the promotion that the resources that we promote to local leaders is to engage older adults at every stage. All of our tools, whether it's placemaking or walk audit or our parks guide, are designed to have older adults at the helm and as participants in the process where you're really thinking through what this public space could do, what this park could offer to the community. So that absolutely is key to ensure that older adults are involved in the planning stages as well as volunteers or staff or community members in the implementation and maintenance stages. Next slide, please. ARP Maryland in particular has been a real leader in this topic, and I want to give a quick shout out to them. They have invested in a fit lot in Hagerstown, which makes physical activity accessible and free and available to people of all ages. It's designed for older adults, but it's also designed to be intergenerational. So that's the picture on the left there that opened maybe 2 years ago. In the middle here is a picture of a community event in Inner Baltimore where it was an intergenerational activity. It was converting some space adjacent to a school, I believe, into this gardening space, this intergenerational park space that really served as a community beacon and a locus for activity. So we're really trying to model the kinds of principles that we seek in public spaces through our own investments, through our own volunteerism, where we brought together all those lovely red-shirted ARP volunteers to help out with the project. And then we bring in local leaders like Gil Peñalosa, who's an internationally renowned speaker on these topics. And we've hosted a number of forums. ARP Maryland has hosted a number of forums where Gil has been brought in to really inspire and talk about and challenge the preconceptions that people have about what older adults want in their public spaces and how to achieve that. So that's—
Sarah Goni, please take a minute to conclude.
Very good. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'd encourage you to go to our website, which is arp.org/livable, to learn more about any of these programs and download the publications that I refer to. Thank you again for your time.
Danielle, thank you. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
Good morning, Governor, members of the Commission. I am Rachel London. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council. And we are a small public policy organization that creates change to make it possible for people with developmental disabilities to live the lives they want with the support they need. Next slide. We do that all under the vision that people with and without disabilities in Maryland live, learn, work, and play together. So this is timely and a priority of ours. Next slide, please. My council or board is primarily people with developmental disabilities and their families. And every 5 years, they create a 5-year state plan or our strategic plan that guides our work. And I put our 3 big goals. Of biggest to note is goal 3, so that people with developmental disabilities and their families have access to their communities. Next slide, please. We do our work in 2 big ways. Of course, our policy work, we educate and advocate. But we are also a grant funding organization. We are 100% federally funded. We put half of our money out a year in grants to other organizations. Next slide, please. We do that on priority issues based on our state plan. And as I mentioned, advocating and funding inclusive recreation is a priority in our next 5-year state plan. The biggest reason this is great timing is because our 5-year state plan started Friday, October 1st. So for the next 5 years, this will be a priority. And one of the reasons is, as you see, there are many, many people with disabilities in Maryland. And according to data from the Office of Disease Prevention, 40% of adults with disabilities report no leisure time recreation activities compared to only 22% of adults without disabilities. Next slide, please. Here is some information that I took off straight from DNR's website about the current accessibility, which I'm going to talk about as I talk about our recommendations. So next slide. When I asked my council members, again, primarily people with developmental disabilities and families, what their number one concern was about their lack of access, was public transportation. So I will say a me too to Mr. Jones. In fact, people with developmental disabilities or families and the people that support them often cite access to public transportation as the number one obstacle to having meaningful days and enjoying what they want to do during those days. And like others, talk about access within those state parks, mobility access, people who use wheelchairs or walkers or other mobility devices. You saw very quickly on the last slide that only 25 of the state parks have accessible picnic and pavilion areas. So enjoying those is difficult for many, many people. And only 8 have adaptive recreation equipment. It's great that 8 do. And my members did say they took advantage of those, but it was only 8. The second about access in state parks are facilities to address the personal needs. So on the next slide, which I'll get to in 1 second, there was legislation that passed this year to require public buildings that were being built or renovated to have adult changing facilities for the personal care of adults. And not only is it a civil rights issue, but it is an issue for families so that they can enjoy with their older children as well. And then finally, communication, right? People, especially people with developmental disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, may need a more accessible communication, and that applies to signs. It applies to the websites that tell them where and what is accessible. And we talk about plain language a lot, and that just means it's easy to understand. It's written in a way, perhaps with pictures, so that everyone can understand what is being said, what the directions are. And in fact, in your packet further down, I think, is a fact sheet that we developed about the legislation about facilities to address personal needs of adults in plain language so that we could share it with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities throughout the state so they would know what to expect. And I included it as an example of how something can be created that is easier to understand, even when it's in legalese, and with the pictures and simplified. Next slide, please.
Ms. London, please take a minute to conclude.
Sure. And so in conclusion, the Changing Facilities Bill, this is just a little bit more information, and it really goes back to the fact that people with disabilities want and need to be fully integrated into society. It not only serves the people with developmental disabilities, but it serves people without disabilities, and so everyone can meaningfully participate. Next slide is really just the last one. Our website, in conclusion, our website was just revised and re-released. The entire thing is in plain language with easier to understand and easy to read documents when necessary. So I've included that here so that you could see further examples of what that means. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Governor, if you want me to go.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Good morning to the commission. Good morning, Governor. I am Frank Lance. I'm the president and CEO of the Parks and People Foundation. You can go to the next slide. We are a 37-year-old organization that operates in Baltimore City exclusively. Equity, justice, and inclusion drives all of our work. As you can see by way of this slide, we seek to improve the quality of life in Baltimore through parks. I'll also add green space and environmental youth programming. We are specifically focused on the Black butterfly, that area of Baltimore that ended up coming about because of redlining. And so we focus on those areas where, it was said earlier, where access for people of color to parks and green space is missing. We're really focused on those areas, even though we will work all throughout Baltimore. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that justice, equity, and integrity guide and inclusion guide all of our work. These are our core values. Everything that we do is focused on these. Next slide, please. I just would like the commission and all of you to know what we've done. So since 2016, we've had this real focus on not only our programming, but in ensuring that parks and green space are available to all of Baltimore. And in that time, we have converted over 26 Baltimore City acres into parks and or green space. Let me explain why that's so critical. In 1950, Baltimore City was 949,000 people. Today, it is 585,000. So there are 360,000 people that no longer call Baltimore City home. Those vacant properties that were needed in 1950 exist in that black butterfly. They exist in those areas that were disenfranchised and redlined. My organization focuses on demolishing those buildings and creating parks and green space in those areas. And since 2016, we've been able to do over 26 acres of land in Baltimore. There are now 80,000 Baltimoreans that are within a 10-minute walk. The national standard for accessibility, and this was referenced earlier, is a 10-minute walk, quarter mile. And so there are now 80,000 Baltimoreans that are within a 10-minute walk of one of our projects. We have raised and reinvested over $5 million into Baltimore City parks and green space. And we've re-engaged communities that were previously disenfranchised by holding charrettes, hearing their visions, and then delivering on what we said to them in those meetings by giving them parks and green space. Next slide. We were asked to address challenges. The challenges really come down to funding. Our primary funding sources are Project Core, CDBG grants, and bond bills. The issue becomes that these funding sources are limited, highly competitive, and extremely restrictive in the sense that they're expected to be used for capital. It does not cover operating costs, which for a nonprofit is a huge drain on us. Next slide. And so one of the other challenges is long-term maintenance. We do this work, as I mentioned, we've done over 26 acres. We'd like to include in each one of our plans at least a 3 to 5 year maintenance plan. That means that there's additional funding that needs to be raised, not only in doing the work, but then also how we maintain it. Ms. Johnson mentioned earlier that funding for rec and parks is underfunded, extremely inequitable as you look to other agencies. So Baltimore City Rec and Parks does not have the funding to do this. Therefore, even though we partner with Rec and Parks on a number of different projects, we have to find the maintenance money. And what we attempt to do is focus on returning citizens and workforce development for maintenance. Another challenge is land acquisition. If we have to go through the receivership process, that can be a 3-year process in order to get the land in order to do the work. And we have seen post-COVID that pricing has increased threefold over what it was prior to COVID. So funding, maintenance, land acquisition, and then pricing. And I believe that's it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brett?
I think Marie's on. I believe you're muted, Mr. Perret.
Mute, currently unmuted. Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And I hopefully my video is on.
Yes.
I apologize for not having slides, just having come back from vacation. I thank Mr. Chairman, the Honorable Governor Glendenning, and distinguished members of the State Park Investment Commission. It's a particular honor to represent the National Federation of the Blind here this morning. We're the oldest, founded in 1940, the oldest and largest civil rights organization of blind people, representing the interest of our nation's blind. And for the past 43 years, we have delightfully and comfortably called Baltimore our home of our national headquarters. I had the distinction some 20 years ago now, I can't believe where the time goes, of representing the NFB at the historic 2001 Everest expedition, featuring Eric Weinmeyer, who was the first blind mountaineer to summit the highest peak on Earth. And he went on to, as part of the elite group that summited all of the highest peaks on each of the continents. And in case if I thought that I got it out of my system, some 10 years later, when Luann Blake and I became married, we spent much of our honeymoon on the Maryland portion of the Appalachian Trail. We completed that a couple of times. And since we went on to lead a hike of some 50 multi-generational blind members of the National Federation of the Blind of Maryland on this, I think it's the Seneca Creek Trail across the Potomac from Great Falls. And this was in partnership with the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. And we had botanists, we had a naturalist that really brought the experience to life for some young people who probably had never seen a tree other than a long sidewalk in a cage in the city. So this was a great experience. I would like to address accessibility. When we talk about accessibility for people with disabilities, which has been very eloquently addressed, we need to talk about different phases, the planning phase. So all the resources associated with our state parks, including our websites, need to be accessible to those of us who need to access the web by alternative means. So this means compliance with web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG 2.0, I think it's AA. This is a federal 508 compliance refresh. That's a must if we're to be able to plan our trips to our state and national treasures. When we're at the park, access to trails, shelters, restroom facilities is important. There's also such a plethora of information provided in our state parks, historic information on plaques and maps and things like this. And there are many ways that are very well developed now to make the signage accessible through either or both audio and Braille means. This is done in a lot of our federal facilities and state parks around the country. So making that a must. Also, I have a particular interest when we're hiking places and great places like the Patapsco State Park. When there are trails or markers on the trees, we know that there is technology under development, a wayfinding technology, to make those splotches on the trees somehow, navigable through apps or other, wayfinding means, and that would also make it possible so that people like my wife and I don't go off trail. I won't, which has happened a few times. And then I would also say, in terms of accessibility, seeking ways to find partnerships with our friends and neighbors with disabilities, so that we have a contributing, ownership in the parks and the upkeep of the parks. Can we involve our members in cleanup efforts, in renovating efforts of shelters? We have such a wealth of talent and skills among the disability community. By the way, please join me in celebrating Blind Equality Achievement Month in October. We are dedicated to the prospect that all blind people and people with disabilities have a right to be contributing tax members of our society. So there are important partnerships to help people in the disability community be visibly involved in the maintenance, upkeep, and promotion of these rich resources. These are the things that I've enjoyed in the times that I've had in our state national parks, and tried to encourage other people, other members of the National Federation of Blind. Please visit our website at nfb.org to learn how to make websites more accessible, learn about our campaign, Blind Equality Achievement Month, and other ways that we can partner together to make Maryland, or really to keep Maryland, because we have a lot to be proud of in this state, a very livable and wonderful place to call our home. That's my presentation, and I'm very much enjoying all of the presentations. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Maurice, thank you very much for your continuing inspirational leadership. We appreciate it. Let me turn at this time to commission members and see if we have questions or comments. I would also indicate that the various presentations will be available to everyone to go through in more detail, and also there may be desirable sometimes to submit a question through staff in writing on this, just because of time considerations. But I know that there are some very important ones that are solved right now. So why don't we go ahead and turn to our commission members. Perhaps I could start with our two co-chairs. Eric or Sarah, do you have any?
I'll defer to the senator, Governor.
Yes, I apologize. I did see your hand up there. I'm still getting this technological stuff.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you, Delegate. This question is for Ms. Johnson, but please, anybody on this panel can jump in. We've obviously talked a lot over the last few meetings about need for more acreage, need for more staff, but I'm curious what you're hearing about need for activities. What kind of recreational activities are you hearing from your communities beyond what we have, beyond hiking? Is it a kayak launch? Is it picnic space? Is it beach space, barbecue space? I'm curious about activities and what you think we could be investing more in.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for allowing us to be here today. I neglected to say that earlier, but the answer is yes to all of the above. But because you have a tremendous amount of new users to state parks, new users don't know what they need, what they want, or what they would like. So there's also an education piece. If you put in a kayak launch, that's great. But if you catch a bus to a state park, if you're fortunate enough to have bus access, how are you going to get your kayak there? So there's this assumption that people know and you don't. Like, how do you get a kayak in the water? Is it an accessible launch? So there are many pieces surrounding that. Can you rent a kayak? So removing those barriers as much as possible. But I think the equipment is one piece that people don't have. I had people who were visiting from Vermont and they were like, "Oh, want to play disc golf with us?" I was like, "Sure." I was like, "Okay." Thankfully, there's Amazon. But what about people who don't have that access? How will they be able to play disc golf? But yes to all of the above that you mentioned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Delegate Lutke.
Thanks, Governor. I'm curious, and maybe this is best put to Ms. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Lance. We have a range of state programs focused on preservation. Most, key among those is program open space. Are any of the tools we have at the state level for, purchasing, developing, maintaining new green space, particularly focused on being targeted by things like the equity tool that we've been introduced to? I mean, are there programs designed at the state level right now that assist, local governments or, nonprofits like the Parks and People Foundation or Land Trust to buy and develop green space in the communities that have the least access to them?
So thank you for your question. Yes, there are. There's the LPPRP, which each jurisdiction has to complete each year. And so we look at equity in the LPPRP report that we do. So yes, we do. It is somewhat challenging though, when you look at your more rural jurisdictions. They traditionally have to save up multiple years in order to be able to purchase one piece of property because of the amount of funding that they receive. So in that aspect, I'd say it's not really equitable, but please don't take away from the larger jurisdictions because we need that funding too.
So does that lead to funding being targeted to communities that, you know, traditionally haven't had access to green space?
It does. When you look at the LPPRP, and many jurisdictions around the state are looking at equity and access. But then if you're looking in your urban areas, particularly in some of the urban, suburban, and rural counties that have all three, the urban areas are somewhat landlocked. So that's more of a challenge there. And you have to be a little bit more creatively, particularly with what Mr. Lance was saying with Parks and People and looking at taking houses that may have been abandoned and turning those into park spaces.
And so thank you, Ms. Johnson. So Delegate, great question. Keep in mind, Baltimore City does not have a state park. And so when we look at POS allocation, yes, we get the local municipality allocation, then Baltimore City gets a second one. The truth of the matter is, because Rec and Parks is so underfunded, that money is critical for what they do. And they really don't have the opportunity then to use it in a way that other jurisdictions like Ms. Johnson may be able to do. So between my organization partnering with Baltimore City Rec and Parks, we try to make that difference. The current director, Reginald Moore, and I, we meet bi-weekly to say, how can we make a difference in disenfranchised communities? But from a funding source, we're trying to make bricks without straw.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, Mr. Lance, let me ask you a specific question. So I'm trying to follow the money, as the old saying goes. Program open space, for example, goes to the city, which then through the city department distributes a variety of either on grants or formulas. Give me a feel specifically, how much money does the foundation receive from program open space?
So Parks and People does not receive any POS money. So Baltimore City Rec and Parks receives POS money. What we then do, the director, Reginald Moore, and I, as I mentioned earlier, we meet bi-weekly to see how we can collaborate. What my organization has to do, we actually raise money every year from philanthropic organizations. We'll go after, as I mentioned, Project Core, CDBG funds. We raise about $6 million annually so that we can then partner with Rec and Parks, and back to Ms. Johnson's point, to try to demolish buildings, do green space, do community charrettes. And so we actually try to help Rec and Parks get that work done. We also have on staff our own landscape architect. We do our own community, we do our own CDs, we do our own construction documents. So we actually work with them to try and get stuff done. And then we have to figure out how do we maintain what they've done and what we've done, because really the maintenance fund isn't there, but we don't get anything from POS. That's Baltimore City Rec and Parks.
Okay, thank you. I am reminded of the old saying in the movie, just follow the money. And I must tell you in all candor, and I'm sure some of my colleagues are saying this, following some of these appropriation funds like Program Open Space and seeing where the money actually ends up in the community, it is a bit of a challenge. But thank you very much. I think Senator Zucker, you were next on the list. Is that right? We'll go to you and then back to Delegate Boyce.
Mr. Chairman, I just had a comment, but I'll save it for the discussion piece. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Boyce.
Thank you so much. Senator Alford actually asked my question, but I had a follow-up, and maybe this is for Rosalind or Franklin. Franklin, you talked about acquisition of property. I'm wondering for acquiring property and/or when we talk about the potential expansion of a park, how does zoning, local zoning, come into play? How does it help you or hurt you?
Great question. As you know, Baltimore City redid its zoning approximately 2 years ago. And so that has been a help. As Ms. Johnson said earlier, and the two of us, she and I could talk all day about this, we are in Baltimore City, so we're landlocked. And as I mentioned earlier, we've had this degradation of population from 949 to 585. A number of those vacant properties are still owned by someone. And so, Delegate, as you know, it's a legal process in order for the city to seize that land. That legal process normally takes about 3 years. So you can have a community ready to go. I can have funding lined up from a philanthropic organization, but I'm normally waiting 3 years before I can give a community that needs green space a park, because I've got to let the legal process play out. So zoning is there. We can work with planning. We can work with housing and community development, but that legal process takes about 3 years. That property could have been vacant for 20 years. It still takes me 3 years to get that property.
And so zoning can also help or hurt us, depending on how it's zoned. We can pay a premium, and sometimes it comes down to how much money we have and how badly we want that property. And sometimes one will take precedent over the other. So it really does just depend. And it's also weighing fairness to the seller as well. So we have to take all of those into account.
Thank you so much. And I have one follow-up question. There was a question about barriers that I thought was pretty awesome. It made me think of the Olmsted in Baltimore City that was supposed to essentially connect park to park. But what I heard was there could be a barrier in that there aren't local parks connected to essentially a state park, like that kind of partnership. Can someone talk a little bit more about that? Is there any partnership somewhere in the state that where that already exists, or there's something that may be coming online, or the quote unquote possibilities of doing that, which means a share of resources from both entities to create it, enhance it, and maintenance it?
So, Delegate,
okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ms. Roslyn, I'll defer to you.
No, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, it's something that Baltimore City would like to see happen. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have, quote unquote, a state park. So we do have our larger parks, Druid Hill Park, Patterson, Gwynns Fall, those kind of things, but we don't have a state park. And again, this whole commission has been about equity and justice. We do think that that is inequitable, but funding comes behind that, and a process comes behind that, and maintenance comes behind that. We've done work. We've looked at other major cities like Philadelphia, and when you look at a funding perspective for our rec and parks to theirs, we are hugely underfunded. And so it is something that Baltimore City would be open to. I'm not sure how to make that happen, Ms. Johnson. I don't know if you have any ideas.
So this is similar to the Tesla and the Prius. They're both electric vehicles, but the car chargers, you can't use them. One can't use the other. So I think that's what we have when we're looking at state parks versus local parks, where in our county, we have a committee looking at our trails, but we don't fold in the state trails. So that's an excellent point. And that's something I think the state could benefit from if all jurisdictions would. I'm sure there's some excellent examples out there. I have to imagine that there are, but off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any. I know, for example, at North Point State Park, we're looking to create some connectivity to their trails. And that's another access and another barrier. If you can walk in again on the trails, then you can access that state park for free. However, if you cannot, then you're paying $3 at the gate, which is another barrier. But I'm also convinced that it also helps the state parks maintain their attendance and their capacity as well.
And thank you. And just a shout out to Baltimore City. There is a Greenwell Trail going in that will connect all kind of parks and green spaces within the city, but it would be awesome to talk about the next step of connecting it out. Thank you so much.
Are there other questions from commission members? Hearing none, let me first of all thank our presenters. We appreciate it very much. There may be some follow-up questions from commissioners, which will come to you through staff on this, and particularly as we go over some of your submitted written information, we may have some additional question or two there as well. But I do appreciate you taking the time out, and hopefully you'll continue to be part of the process as we go through our final deliberations. Thank you all very much. And at this point, we'll move to our second panel. on environment and allied stakeholders. And this will start with Mr. Joel Dunn, who's been waiting patiently here, President and CEO of Chesapeake Conservatory. And I would like, as we could, just we said in the first panel, just to flow on through this automatically, so that next presenter will just step in when Mr. Dunn has concluded. And then we'll also follow through the questions from the commissioners at the end of the full presentations. Mr. Dunn?
Good morning. My name is Joel Dunn. I'm the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy. I wanted to note that Maite Arce is also one of our key board members, who you heard from a little earlier. I wanted to thank the members of this commission for your great work on behalf of Marylanders. I wanted to thank Governor Glendening for your long-term conservation leadership. And I wanted to thank Jeremy and Andrew for their hard work to bring us together. There are several important areas that need investment and improvement in Maryland's state parks, and the Conservancy has several thoughts and ideas to share with this commission. In the interest of time, though, I want to limit my comments, provide you with some summary recommendations, and just talk briefly about why state parks are important from a conservation and people perspective. The Conservancy will send a follow-up document with some detailed recommendations. So briefly, we, the Conservancy, believe the Commission need to recommend the following four things. The first is the development of a long-term capital budget plan separate from program open space funding to replace and construct facilities within state parks. We might even want to think about the Stadium Authority model or a program like that, which has been very successful, but for state parks. The second recommendation is the development of a long-term staffing plan starting in the next fiscal year. The state park staff are the unsung heroes of the conservation movement, but they're overburdened, and to protect the resources of our parks and serve the visitors of our state, we need more staff with additional skills. The third recommendation is the development of or promotion of a long-term land acquisition plan near current state parks where feasible, as well as new state parks, particularly those with water access. And the fourth recommendation is to think beyond state parks and develop an urban equivalent to the Rural Legacy Program for our under-resourced communities, especially those of color, to provide a variety of green spaces like parks, trail connectors, pocket parks, community gardens, to really enhance health and quality of life as a complement to state parks. On the national level, last year, the Great American Outdoors Act paired full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund for land acquisition for new parks with a separate and distinct initiative called the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, which provided funding for maintenance for critical facilities and infrastructure. And that was from a separate funding source. So this is a really good and interesting model for us to follow and think about for our state parks. Next slide, please. State parks play a really vital role in protecting nature and showcasing sustainable practices and connecting people to nature, especially through outdoor recreation. They're an important part of our green infrastructure network. And all of you know, they've seen a huge increase in usership in the last 2 years, which is great, but also a challenge. Bigger picture, Maryland's landscape has changed a lot over the last 50 years. There's been a lot of development, and over 1 million acres since 1973 have been lost. Forest land, farmland, they've been developed. So we're really fortunate to have program open space as a tool to counter that development, to protect land. It's really helped us balance out growth and protect open space, which we all need for lots of reasons. Habitat loss at the local, state, and national, and even global level the climate crisis are big threats to our biodiversity and ecosystem services. And our state's going to see another 1 million people come here by 2050. So we really need to get ahead of that and think through our park system and our land conservation system. There's a big challenge out there around the world to conserve 30% of the Earth's land and water a national challenge from President Biden. I think we should think about that at the state level too. You know, the real challenge is trying to protect 50% by 2050. That's the scientists' guidance. So I think we can pursue a vision like that here. Next slide. This map shows that Maryland state parks are really an important part of our bigger green infrastructure network. The areas in red are state parks. The area in green are all protected lands, and the area in yellow are our targeted ecological areas. These state parks are an important part of serving our working class families and a real important part of our green infrastructure. Next slide. They're one of the best places where we can connect people to nature, educate them about the natural world, and inspire them to become the next stewards of our environment. One of our theories of change at the Chesapeake Conservancy is that connecting people to the outdoors is key to the future of our society, and we want to inspire those future leaders. Next slide. I know you've heard from Wendy O'Sullivan from the National Park Service about the partnership we have with Maryland State Parks to provide bilingual rangers. But this work is really important because it's a great demonstration of the opportunity we have for engagement with park visitors, the Latino community, particularly at a place like Sandy Point. They represent many of the visitors at state parks, and a lot of them don't even know that much about the Chesapeake Bay. And it's not as much of an alarm bell as it is like a fireworks, right? Like we need, this is a huge opportunity for us to engage outdoor enthusiasts and build the next generation of conservation leaders in the state. So, and state parks are the key place to do that. We're really—
Mr. Dunn, please take 1 minute to conclude.
Okay, great. I'm right on time here. Next slide. So this brings me to my final point I wanted to engage on, which is the need for an urban equivalent to the Rural Legacy Program. It's important to realize that the need for green space and the need for equity when it comes to access and visitor experience goes well beyond state parks. The pandemic really dramatically demonstrated the public health impacts in under-resourced communities of color, and we really see that land conservation and parks are a key strategy for human health, community livability, and creating those green spaces within those communities is key. I wanted to highlight that the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership has produced an action plan on public health, green spaces, and equity through a series of 4 listening sessions we held last year with diverse audiences, and I'm planning to share that with the commission. So anyways, Governor Glendening, you pulled off a big one when you set up the Rural Legacy Program many years ago. We really think that coming out of these sessions, it'd be great if you could think through an urban equivalent to that program moving forward. With that, I conclude my testimony, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share those thoughts with you.
Joel, thank you very much for your comment. I want to add something later in the discussion about the urban legacy approach. Turn to the next panelist, please.
Well, good morning, Governor Glendening and members of the commission, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Dean Hughes. I'm the president of the Maryland Rangers Association. And on behalf of my colleagues from across the state, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to the commission for recognizing that our parks are under extraordinary stress. And we are extremely moved by the testimony in support of our park system by so many stakeholders on this call today. And we're humbled that you've asked us to help you in identifying solutions that could make Maryland State Parks a model for the nation. Next slide, please. As Delegate Lutke eloquently characterized it in the first meeting, our state parks are a treasure that have been handed down to us in trust, and we have an obligation to hand them in trust to the next generation. Maryland Rangers are the chief stewards of our irreplaceable natural, cultural, and historical sites, and we are witnessing firsthand how decades of inadequate funding and chronic understaffing is leading to damage in many places as we struggle to meet the demands associated with the historic demand for access to our parks. Since 2003, our state parks visitation has doubled, causing many parks, particularly those with access to water, to reach their cultural and ecological carrying capacities and close more frequently and for longer duration than ever before in our history. Next slide. As this is placing enormous pressure on our natural outlying areas, especially in our river valley parks, where people seeking access to water gather in great numbers. Even though these areas were not intended or ever designed for this type of intensive use and lack adequate parking, grills, restrooms, and other supporting infrastructure, we're seeing how the sheer number of people is causing irreparable damage to sensitive environments and leading to enormous challenges associated with trash. I work at Gunpowder Falls in Baltimore County, and to give you an idea of the scale of this issue, last summer our staff spent almost 500 hours picking up and removing nearly 10,000 pounds of trash along just one half-mile stretch of the Gunpowder River. Many of our stream valley parks have numerous remote hotspots where people congregate, and a lack of attention to these areas generates significant complaints from local communities negatively impacted. Next slide. Recurring deferrals of critical maintenance funding and capital improvements at a time when park attendance is at historically high levels is straining and overwhelming aging infrastructure and resulting in frequent facility breakdowns. Our dedicated ranger and maintenance staff work tirelessly in an effort to mask cosmetic defects and deteriorating facilities so that the public doesn't notice them, but there's little that they can do to hide buckling roadways or collapsing sewage lines, failing electrical systems, or crumbling historic structures. Many of our parks were developed in the 30s through the 60s and are in need of ADA retrofits and improvements to bring them to modern standards. In addition, expansive and grossly understaffed state park complexes necessitate that rangers focus almost entirely on core operations and maintenance duties, with little time to engage visitors or conduct interpretive or outreach programs that connect children with nature. The unsustainable practice of acquiring, developing, and operating new state parks without supplemental personnel or resources is straining our workforce and leading many otherwise dedicated rangers to seek similar positions with higher salaries at county parks, and a painfully slow process to backfill vacancies further exacerbates the stress on our workforce. Simply put, our park system is unable to keep pace with the increase in demands being placed on it from every direction, and decades of inadequate funding and chronic understaffing is compromising our ability to accomplish the mission and properly preserve, protect, enhance, and restore our irreplaceable resources so that we can guarantee that the next generation is able to enjoy them the same way we do today. With an annual operating budget of roughly $50 million and 21 million visitors last year, spending barely $2 per visitor simply does not demonstrate the type of commitment owed to significant public resource, nor does it reflect the value placed on having healthy and robust state parks by the millions of people who are using them each year. Next slide. Key to the continuity and stewardship obligation inherited from our predecessors are the men and women of the Park Service. This image very simply illustrates the decline in state park staffing relative to historic levels. In 2005, the decision to implement one of the recommendations from the Mandel Commission resulted in the single most significant and consequential action to ever impact our state parks, when not only was the law enforcement responsibility transferred to the Natural Resources Police, but in doing so, 100 rangers were transferred out of the Park Service. This significant action resulted in much more than the loss of 100 positions responsible for every facet of park operations. It resulted in the loss of decades of institutional knowledge and the irreplaceable commodity of our future leaders. We've been in a rebuilding mode ever since, struggling to restore adequate staffing levels and learn the lessons that our predecessors were unable to pass on. In 2013, visitation was half of what it was today when DNR and DBM collaborated on a strategic plan which identified the 70 additional positions were needed to meet the then current demands. In the more than 8 years since that plan was submitted, 25 new state parks or areas have been acquired or opened, and yet only 13 positions have been added. Not only have we never been able to fully recover from the law enforcement merger, we're actually falling behind as we open and expand new parks. 2 weeks ago, DNR highlighted some of these wonderful new places, but what was not presented was that in many cases, these new parks came online without more permanent personnel and are being operated by staff at complexes where they're already struggling. Wolf Den Run, for example, is managed by the same staff responsible for Harrington Manor and Swallow Falls. Patuxent River and the Monocacy NRMA are managed by Seneca Creek and have no dedicated staff assigned to them. And as Senator Elfreth mentioned, Franklin Point State Park is managed by Sandy Point, which I think we all know is one of the busiest parks in our system. Making that situation even more challenging is that the staff at Sandy Point is also responsible for 2 other state park units the sprawling Severn Run National Environmental Area, and the ecologically significant Belt Woods. Next slide. These complexes, many of which were clustered together during lean budget years as a cost-saving measure, have grown steadily and become rather unwieldy. Like the Tuckahoe complex on the Eastern Shore, which includes 11 different parks spread out over 77 miles in 4 counties, or the Southern Maryland complex, which manages 18 separate parks that can't even all fit on this map. Because of this, interaction with a ranger is oftentimes extremely rare in many of our parks, as rangers are concentrated in operationally intensive day use areas and unable to visit the outlying areas or even entire parks on a regular basis. It's not hard to imagine the opportunities we miss to foster future stewards by there simply not being enough of us. Delegate Boyce, you inquired at the last meeting about the proper investment in staff. Using the 2013 plan as a start, we already know that 70 additional people are needed, and we believe that that number is easily 2 or 3 times that today. We also need to stress that the additional staff will need the proper resources and tools to do their job, like vehicles, equipment, uniforms, and workspace. Next slide, please. As we look towards enhancing current staffing levels, we also need to address streamlining the process for classified and seasonal employee hiring. As typically, it takes upwards of 6 months to a year to fill critical permanent positions. In addition to the heavier workload imposed on remaining staff, we've seen positions lost when the same bureaucracy responsible for the hiring process deems the position to be unnecessary due to the extended period of vacancy. State parks also rely on a very robust surge of seasonal employees to perform mission critical functions. And on average, it can take 2 months to hire a single seasonal employee. If a maintenance employee quits on a Friday afternoon, someone still needs to pick up the trash and clean the restrooms on Saturday morning. And rangers often have no choice but to step in and pick up the slack. The inability to promptly backfill our vacancies is absolutely killing us, and it's imposing additional stress on the remaining staff, accelerating burnout and compromising our ability to provide for public safety, resource protection, and the visitor experience. Senator Patterson, you noted during DNR's presentation that the picture of our last Ranger School class did not appear to be inclusive or representative of our park visitors. We work very hard to engage those who may not have previously considered a career with the Park Service and commit significant staff resources and fiscal resources to programs like the Conservation Jobs Corps and SME Parquet. It frustrates us that our investment in these programs has not translated into a single Park Service career beyond short-term service. It's likely that the unrealistic workloads I've already described, as well as the current compensation levels, are an impediment to presenting a career with the Park Service as an attractive option. And thereby it's impeding our success in recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce. Most people enter the park ranger profession based on their passion for our mission and stewardship of our natural resources, yet they still need to earn a living wage to support their families. We often say that our maintenance employees are among our most valuable, as they regularly perform miracles when major facility breakdowns occur on the most busy days. Yet they're working at or near the minimum wage and know that they can make significantly higher salaries in the private sector and at other park agencies. We lose good people all the time to county agencies because their salaries are more in line with the industry standard for the same work. Next slide, please. In closing, the current trajectory of our state parks is simply not sustainable, and we're in desperate need of a major investment to meet our state's growing demand for outdoor recreation. Our park system portfolio has grown for years without a commensurate increase in staff, and the increase in visitation and resource management needs is threatening our ability to preserve and protect our natural, cultural, and historical sites. Our parks need a historic investment to hire adequate permanent staff, repair and update old and failing infrastructure, and need to continue to grow to meet the needs of our citizens. Next slide. We believe that Maryland has significant opportunity to expand our park system in the pursuit of both preservation and outdoor recreation equity goals, and that the acquisition of those new opportunities should be aggressively pursued, particularly those that could satisfy a critical need for water access in or near metropolitan areas. Our hope for this commission is that it will be for state parks what the Thornton Commission was for education, and give life to a new progressive era in our state park system's history, one which future generations will look back on with admiration and gratitude for visionary leadership and bold action. Maryland Rangers stand ready not only to carry out the Commission's vision and ensure that our state parks are accessible and meet the growing needs of all Maryland citizens, but we believe that with your leadership and support, we are the best people positioned to accomplish those goals. On behalf of the hardworking men and women of the Park Service, the 21 million people who visited our state parks last year, and the countless generations of Marylanders that will follow in our footsteps, I'd like to thank each one of you for being champions of our state parks, and we'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sobering presentation. We appreciate it. Our next speaker.
Good morning. My name is Mel Poole. I currently serve as president of Friends of Maryland State Parks. Prior to this, I enjoyed a 37-year career as a park ranger and superintendent with the National Park Service. The Friends thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony to the commission. Since the Friends believe that our state parks' natural, recreational, and cultural resources should be sustained now and for future generations, and that our state park system should aspire to be a national model, we fully support the commission's area of investigation and development of strategic recommendations regarding overcrowding in Maryland state parks. The adequacy of existing state park facilities to meet the demand for recreational opportunities in the state has been lagging for years, as visitation in state parks has trended steadily upward. This gathering storm of visitation has become a hurricane, courtesy of the COVID pandemic, as visitation has doubled from 10 million in 2013 to 21.5 million in 2020, and placed enormous pressure on park rangers and operational staff, facilities, and infrastructure. Maryland park rangers and associated maintenance and operational staff need to be recognized as frontline essential employees and first responders and compensated as highly trained visitors and resource protection specialists who keep parks safe and accessible through standardized and mandated training and certification programs. Non-competitive compensation levels relative to local and state and federal park systems and pay compression issues between supervisory and non-supervisory positions also indicate the need for a full personnel classification review and upgrade of the Maryland Park Service organization. We believe that current staffing levels are woefully inadequate and recommend at least 100 permanent classified positions are required to adequately serve pre-pandemic visitation levels as stated in the 2012 and the 2016 Park Service strategic plans. Also, critical maintenance backlog is growing and needs a long-term solution. For the 2022 budget, the backlog has grown from 263.8 million from 40 million in 2018, a 62% increase. Given acquisition, design, and construction timelines and inflation factors, we believe that the backlog is in reality closer to $100 million and steadily growing. We have the same problem with the capital improvement budget as projects continue to be delayed and deferred to out years. These deferments accelerate facility deterioration and cause avoidable cost increases. In 2020, the federal government finally addressed growing capital and facility maintenance backlog for national parks. We think Maryland needs to do the same for its state parks. Thanks to POS, Maryland is a national leader with 25% of its land base in some form of protection, but only about 12% of that land is permanently protected recreational open space. The current national agenda calls for 30% land protection by 2030 to assure climate resiliency and ecological diversity. We recommend that Maryland create a similar vision and implement the national agenda at the state level to further user equity and environmental justice. New state park offerings are needed in all areas of the state. Natural areas featuring bay, river, and stream corridor protection in urban areas and sensitive habitat protection are important natural resource features that need further protection in state parks. Connectivity between existing and proposed parks need to be addressed through the development of a statewide land and water trail system that develops both east-west and north-south routes across Maryland. cultural resource areas, including archaeological sites, historic sites, and battlefields, need inventory designation, enhanced visitor interpretation, and targeted funding sources. And we need to accommodate diverse and underserved visitor populations. And to do that requires parkland acquisition close to urban centers to minimize transportation and energy costs. Encouraging public transportation can reduce vehicle congestion in parks during times of peak visitation and open opportunities for underserved populations. We need to create intermodal parks near interstates, US highways, trails, transit centers, rail, and subway stops. We support a high standard of equal and equitable access to state parks across Maryland as a matter of environmental justice and a basic right of citizenship through the removal of cultural and geographic barriers to park enjoyment. Maryland is ranked #1 in highest median income in the United States since 2013. From 2013 to 2018, the Maryland Park Service operating budget as a percent of state budget has ranked between 37th and 34th. At the same time, Maryland State Parks annually contributed $17 million in visitor fees and $50 million in taxes to the state's economy, along with 13,000 jobs and $1.3 billion in economic impact. Additionally, 8,000 volunteers and 32 friends groups annually donated 200,000 hours valued at $5.7 million to the Maryland Park Service.
Mr. Poole, please take 1 minute to conclude.
We believe that it's time for the Maryland state government to do more for its state parks, to return them to national model status, and the Friends of Maryland State Parks stand ready to walk that path with you to implement and enhance the effectiveness of your recommendations. Thank you for your time today. Be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Mr. Reddick.
Hi, I'm Nick Redding. I'm the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, and thrilled to be here today and appreciate the opportunity to present before this commission. Preservation Maryland just celebrated our 90th anniversary, and as an organization, this issue matters desperately to us, and I don't want to repeat anything that's already been said, and so I'm going to stick primarily to historic and cultural resources and the need for access, which you've heard over and over again, and already have heard a lot of really great points on all of this. And we'll be following up with the committee. We have written testimony that we've presented and provided, but also some technical points on these issues. But like you've heard, just like at the National Park Service level, here in Maryland, we have a multi-million-dollar backlog of maintenance. And so much of that is focused on historic and cultural resources. Maryland, as you've heard over and over again from different presenters, needs its own Great American Outdoors Act, which is a massive infusion of capital into the national park system. And much of that has to do, of course, with acquisition of land through the Land and Water Conservation Fund at the federal level, but much of it also has to do with the restoration of cultural resources. In fact, over $3 billion of what's being invested in the national parks is going into cultural resources. So why do we need to do this? Why should it matter? Well, interestingly, in 2014, the DNR survey that looked at the Land and Recreation Protection Plan found that tied only with walking, visitors were looking for visiting historic and cultural resources. So the #1 and #2 thing that they were looking for in visiting state parks were walking and visiting historic and cultural resources. Yet we invest so little when it comes to historic and cultural resources compared to all the other activities in our state parks, even though that's what visitors ranked as the second thing that they were looking for, tied only with walking. And so we obviously need to listen to who it is who's visiting the parks, but also it's an opportunity for us to invest in underrepresented stories. If you look at the places that aren't being protected, if you look at the maintenance backlog, it has to do primarily with the stories of people who haven't been traditionally represented in our state parks histories. And so when it comes to land acquisition, when it comes to protecting historic places and the places that we invest in, we have a real opportunity to tell the story of all of Maryland if we do this correctly and if we make preservation and restoration of cultural resources a priority. So we need to invest clearly. It makes sense. And now's the time, I think, and you heard, I think Joel mentioned this and others, to think about how we use our program open space funds. And we need to balance both access with acquisition. It's not enough just to acquire land and not provide access to it and not to increase and enhance the resources therein. It's not enough to buy land, but let historic resources melt away and do nothing about it. And so obviously our recommendation is to balance those two needs and to invest significantly in our cultural and historic resources. One recommendation that we provided in our written testimony that we've been significantly involved in at the federal level is to develop a state historic trade score based on a highly successful National Park Service program, actually based out of Maryland, that would allow us not only to efficiently and effectively restore historic places, but develop a diverse recruitment pool of those types of rangers that we heard are so desperately needed in the service. We also need to reiterate and focus on expanding access to existing parks and expanding access to our historic and cultural resources. And so, again, I appreciate the opportunity and just wanted to underscore, given the fact that the Maryland Park Service owns and protects and operates more historic resources than any other entity in the state of Maryland, it's important that this is a part of the formula moving forward and that we find ways to creatively and effectively invest in these resources. And so as an organization, we stand prepared to provide technical support, philanthropic support as we do at a variety of different levels and advice in any way we possibly can to the work of this commission moving forward, and appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentations, we have added one additional presenter here representing MPEC, Chris Gazera. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Oh, it's Zara, like the Tsar of Russia, okay. And Ra, the sun god. Win-win. So first, I want to just preface and say that there is a written testimony that was submitted as a supplement to my oral testimony today. Chair Glendenning and members of the commission, the Park Service Associates, commonly known as park rangers, stand in solidarity with our union brothers and sisters in the Maryland Professional Employees Council Local 6197, as we state the improvements needed to sustain current and future operational conditions in the Maryland Park Service. First, Maryland Park Rangers ask for the reinstatement of our yearly step increase. Employee turnover is high due to low wages and increased responsibility. To compete with other professions in our area and to ensure a high quality workforce, park rangers' wages must be competitive. Second, park rangers are and should be recognized as first responders. Park rangers are trained for and provide the same type of emergency services as EMTs, police, and firefighters. Many times, park rangers have saved lives due to our level of training and professionalism. We ask the commission to recommend that park rangers be reclassified from Park Service Associates to first responders. The park rangers feel these two actions could help fill vacant positions. The Maryland Park Service is severely understaffed. We need more highly qualified personnel to effectively operate the park and visitor services. The Park Service has provided seasonal supplemental staff, but this is not enough. With current staffing levels, one park ranger out on sick leave could mean there are no trained personnel available to operate the park. Park rangers staffing has diminished over the years as attendance has increased. Finally, the park rangers asked the commission to strongly recommend more funding for Maryland state parks. We need upgraded bathhouses, sewage treatment systems, maintenance equipment, and campground sites that can accommodate large recreational vehicles with 50-amp plugs. Our mowers and maintenance equipment are so outdated that the state spends more money in overtime pay repairing old machinery than it would to cost new equipment. Park rangers are passionate about our work. We give our all to the public. We keep our parks safe and clean for recreation. We promote better health, not just physical, but spiritual, emotional, and mental as well. And we bring not only family and friends, but also our local communities together in our great outdoors. Park rangers are stewards of our state's most precious public lands, and we should be treated with the dignity and respect we work for and deserve. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the presenters. We appreciate it, and we appreciate the efforts to stay within time limits so we can have some discussions as we proceed through this. Let me pause at this moment and ask commission members if they have questions or comments. I see I think the first hand up this time was Delegate Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it was actually Senator Alford.
Thank you, Delegate. Thank you, Governor. I apologize. I had to run across the street to greet a sixth grade class.
I see what the problem is. I'm thinking to myself, how can I miss this? You have a yellow background there, and your yellow hand blends right into that, and I didn't see that. I apologize.
It's okay. I apologize for stepping away. I had a sixth grade class coming to view the documents of the State House, so I had to scurry across the street and back over here. So I apologize if I missed this point, but for Mr. Hughes and I'm apologize, Cesara. Okay. What we've been hearing this, and I appreciate that staffing levels have been reduced over the last year, decade plus. What is the feedback that you hear from this administration as to why, or how is the state justifying that reduced staffing level?
Well, Senator Alford, thank you for that question. I think it's just a matter of modern times that we have challenges across our system, not only in the parks. I think it's across the state of Maryland, and I know through participation and in the legislative process, especially the budget process over the last couple of years, I've heard that this is not a problem unique to the Department of Natural Resources. I think that the department could probably provide a good answer as to why the staffing levels are not as robust as they ought to be, given the increase in demand. But frankly, I really think that it's a system-wide problem, and that they would probably be able to provide the best answer.
Okay, I appreciate your diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Let's turn to Delegate Boyce.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to start backwards with Mr. Cesara. You mentioned, so just so I'm clear, the park rangers are in fact the maintenance crew, is what you're telling me?
Yes, that's one of their roles that they actually do. That's part of their job specs, is a certain amount of maintenance work, but it's pretty much absolutely just every day. The operational park rangers are involved directly or indirectly, much of the time directly, doing maintenance as part of their duties.
Yeah, so we don't have like a cleaning crew per se that could come in.
Well, we do have a maintenance department, but it's again, it's just like everyone has to chip in, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a follow-up. Whether it's Mr. Hughes or you can, is there, when you come to the parks, is there a list somewhere, whether it's online or visible, about what can and cannot be brought into a state park as it relates to having to clean up like trash? We say no glass, or what is allowed or not allowed, just briefly, in the parks, or is there such a thing?
Well, thank you, Delegate Boyce. Absolutely. At most of the places that people access the parks, there are bulletin boards with signage that have the park rules on them. We also have in many places throughout the park, we have the rules and regulations established in COMAR, which express a lot of our policies and rules on trash and littering. So I believe this information is also on our website, but at the very least, as people arrive, they definitely have that information posted.
Okay, so I think I'm being more specific about, are there certain items that cannot be brought into a park, especially if you're driving in, as it relates to trash and littering in the parks?
Are you talking about like, because
like you would recommend not to bring, for instance, glass, because you're recommending not to bring certain items or products that people would usually potentially pack and bring with them that ends up being litter that's more harmful than maybe someone threw their banana peel out.
The underlying principle that we use for voluntary compliance when we're talking with staff, like for example at Patapsco, certain areas we have restrictions on certain things like bringing in grills and stuff like that affect the any potential fire hazards going in there. But for the trash, our principle of leave no trace is the thing I use most often with the public, that essentially they can come in, bring in anything and for their picnic, if it's glass, plastic, whatever, but they have to take everything out with them, and just leave the embers from their grills, from the grills in the park, and so that's essentially, but there's no, in terms of, we're not restricting anything being brought in that's, people would normally bring into a picnic or all day event.
Okay, I'm just curious, because the first thing that comes to my mind, for instance, like plastic bags, which I'm sure is a problem, and whether or not something like that would be restricted. I'll just go quickly to my last question to Preservation Maryland. I believe that was Mr. Redding. You mentioned per the 2014 DNR survey that visitors were looking for walking spaces and historical and cultural resources. Are there any sites or cultural experiences or historical sites that Preservation Maryland has considered underrepresented or not appropriately marked off and a place that someone can visit, or a place where we know a thing happened, but we don't necessarily have it identified and marked?
Yeah, I think a good example of that, that fortunately there's been some state interest in it, but it is an example of it kind of playing out, and something that is happening in a lot of other places, is at Fort Frederick. So you think of Fort Frederick as a French and Indian era war fort, right? Well, there's layers of history, of course. And interestingly, Fort Frederick is there today because an African-American family stewarded that land, and the state was able to purchase it in the early 20th century. But that whole story was completely missing. If you went to Fort Frederick, that story didn't exist there. It was the story of the French and Indian War, and not the Black family that protected it and kept it there so that the CCC could come in the 30s and fix it. That is slowly being resurrected, and there's a historic African-American building on site that was almost completely lost, and now some money is going into it. But there's a perfect example of how there's these layers of history and pieces of it are missing, and that's just one example of it. Go to South Mountain Battlefield. There's tremendous Black history, tremendous women's history, but really the dominant story is the battle. And that's one piece of it. But there are so many layers of history that make history, at least for me, more interesting. And so I think that is writ large across the system. One concept that we've had is that there should be sort of an underrepresented history fund dedicated so that the state parks can deploy those funds and create interpretation that talks about these diverse layers and diverse stories. But yeah, there are countless examples of that playing out across the system. And there's a huge opportunity to tell a much more complex and interesting story about Maryland. And it also plays out in the way we acquire. So are we weighing diverse history when we go to acquire new property and develop new state parks? And how are we telling those stories on existing parks? So yeah, it is a fantastic question.
And so those are just two examples. So are you telling me there are several of these, or there's stuff that you have and know that are kind of in the waiting, or they just haven't been told?
Yeah, I think like was said before, the answer is yes to all of that. And I think I would wager that at every state park, there is an important story about different aspects of Maryland history that hasn't been explored, and that is not being interpreted correctly. And I don't mean correctly, but just isn't even being interpreted. That story isn't even being told. I mean, think about Fort Frederick. Most people on this call probably wouldn't know that Fort Frederick is here because of an enterprising African-American family that stewarded that land. And we're missing out on a really rich story when we don't tell those things. So yeah, I think every state park has a more diverse and interesting story to tell, and a more layered story. And we could definitely follow up and provide more of that background for you.
Thank you so much.
I see distinguished Vice Chair Budke has a question.
Distinguished. I appreciate that, Governor. Let me follow up on a couple. I think this has been a tremendously productive meeting today, and we've gotten a lot of very good suggestions and very good ideas for recommendations from the commission. I do want to follow up on what I think are two absolutely key issues. That's the staffing and the maintenance. So let me start first. Mr. Hughes, Mr. Zara, we've heard a lot about how understaffed the parks are, and we keep adding more units and not adding new staff. And I was particularly struck last meeting, at the end of the meeting, by the presenter from the National Park Service, who expressed shock at the level of understaffing in comparison to National Park Service properties like the Anacostia system. But it occurs to me that we've got a number of parks in the state that are sort of partner state parks with federal parks, and that would provide a really apt comparison. So do you happen to know, for example, Cunningham Falls State Park and Catoctin Mountain Park, what the staffing comparison is between those two facilities, or Assateague State Park and Assateague National Seashore?
Yes, Delegate Lidke, thanks for that question. And actually, when Ms. O'Sullivan shared that shocking number of 240 people for just Anacostia, and that's as many as we have for the entire statewide network of our park system, roughly. And so that got us thinking, and I reached out to my colleague who manages Assateague Island, because like you said, there's a sister park right next to it that's a national model. And I asked her, I said, how many rangers do we have, or actually, what is the size of our entire staff at Assateague? And do you happen to know what the National Park Service has? And she told me that there was only 10 permanent employees assigned to Assateague State Park. And she reached out to her counterpart on the national side, and she returned with 50. They have 50 permanent employees, and she went on to say that doubles in the summertime when they bring on their seasonal staff. I reached out to my colleague at Cunningham as well, because there's a couple of examples around the state, and his 10 permanent employees are compared to 43 for Catoctin. And those parks are pretty different. Cunningham has a full-scale beach operation and campground. So there's a remarkable disparity between the state side versus the national side as you start to look at it.
So Cunningham, you've got 10 full-time staff that manage this beach that, the park gets shut down sometimes because so many people show up at the beach during the summer. So to manage the beach, to manage significant campgrounds, because there's a lot of campsites there. Catoctin doesn't have camping, does it? And it doesn't have a beach.
I'm fairly certain it doesn't.
So that's 4.5 times as much staff for, okay. On the other side, and maybe Mr. Poole, you're the best one to answer this question. So we've heard a lot about the critical maintenance backlog, and the legislature helped fight for $20 million of additional funding to address that backlog this session, thanks to the work of the Appropriations and Budget and Tax Committee. But one of the things I've heard are questions about whether there is the capacity. Let me ask this. If the state were to commit $100 million tomorrow to fixing the entire critical maintenance backlog, would DNR have the staffing capacity to actually manage that many maintenance projects?
No.
Mr. Poole, you can take that if you want.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to. I think the answer is no, because for several reasons. I think, first of all, they don't have the design staff to handle it. I think, secondly, you have a major acquisition problem trying to get the projects contracted for. And I think those are the two biggest bottlenecks that you would face in order to push those projects out the door. They just don't have the capacity to handle that. And especially right now, as I understand it, they've had large number of retirements amongst their design staff. And there's also a reluctance amongst their acquisition folks to do design build projects where they actually just push the projects out the door to A&E firms to do design build rather than to design in-house and contract for those projects. So right now, design and construction is a bottleneck within itself, but there's also an acquisition bottleneck on top of that. And both of those together give you significant inflationary issues to deal with.
Delegate Lukey, if I could just follow up on that for a second.
Sure.
One thing that's worked really well and showed some promise on the land acquisition side has been something called advance acquisition that allows land trusts and nonprofit partners to support the state because the land acquisition process can be so cumbersome. It allows nonprofit partners to partner with the state to help acquire land. And then there's either a same-day closing or a due diligence period, and then it goes to the state. And it allows the state to move quicker to acquire land. There could be a similar process with maintenance and repair, particularly with historic resources and others, with nonprofit partners doing advanced rehabilitation or providing those services in partnership with the state. And that also dovetails into this idea of a historic trade score, is that a trade score could be providing some of these services and assisting the state in doing this. But to the question about capacity, again, we come back to the fact that when it comes to historic trades, for example, whereas the National Park Service has an entire historic trades training program, and almost every park has somebody on staff with some background and skills on that, there are very few historic tradespeople, if any, in the Park Service, other than people who kind of picked it up over time. But it's not a classification. It's not a division unto itself. And so it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So I think to that point, though, about capacity, there could be an opportunity to mirror, and we've begun kind of looking at it, an advanced acquisition, almost an advanced rehabilitation program to partner with the state to provide lower cost rehabilitation and preservation services, and as well that historic trades piece that not only addresses that, but could provide a really interesting opportunity to create a recruitment pool for the service.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor.
Didn't I see Senator Zucker's hand up a moment ago?
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I lost my video feed. I think the panelists answered a lot of my questions. I guess the only question I have is in terms of, Delegate Lukey mentioned the $100 million figure in terms of critical maintenance. Is there a figure besides the $20 million that you all would be able to deal with the acquisition and the other components and get up and running?
Well, Senator Zucker, thank you. I'll take a crack at that. The critical maintenance backlog is very measurable, and there are a number of things that I think that list does not even include, like many of our historic structures and all of the various assets that we manage that, we wish we could restore. I think generally the critical maintenance list oftentimes includes assets that have a very public component to them. And oftentimes some of our historical assets may take a backseat to that. So, $100 million for critical maintenance alone may just be the start. As far as the operational component, that's that's going to probably just be some simple adding of the number of physicians deemed necessary, and also, the additional seasonal staff and other resources that would sustain the work of those operational people. I don't have a figure for that offhand, but it'd probably be within $100 million or so.
Thank you. I have found, by the way, it's the always or so that you add at the end of your sentence that tends to get us. Yes, I also must say, presentation. Let me ask first, did I miss anyone? Is everyone for questions? We'll try to wrap this up fairly quickly. I do want to say the presentations were excellent, but I also believe that this has reflected part of the problem that I am seeing, and that is from within the department itself. I do not see the ability to identify very specific list of ongoing maintenance needs, of a plan to eliminate those needs, of ongoing wage disparities, of a plan to address those disparities, and so on. And I will confer with the staff later, but I think we need a far more specific presentation, because there was a lot of points raised here by segments, but not the big picture. And so we will come back to talk about this a bit more with the vice chairs and then with the staff as well. Let me also add just very quickly a couple of points. One was on the discussion of the rural legacy and the urban legacy. I think that's interesting. We started the rural legacy, and some of the great parks have been purchased and expanded under that program, and I'm pleased to see the continuing legislative support for that. The urban legacy, quite candidly, was started primarily as an effort to provide small grants and additional incentives to especially some of our smaller communities throughout the state for urban revitalization, for investment. And the idea was, if these communities were thriving, then you wouldn't have sprawl pushing out into the open space. And the reason I say that, and I'm not sure to what extent the urban legacy is still utilized. I think I saw a couple of references to it, so I think it still is. I know the rural legacy is, but that does pose a question, and that is, should one of our considerations or thinking about actually be to create some type of urban legacy, but with a different name, presumably, that is designed to do exactly that, focus on open space parkland. And one thing that I know a number of states are doing, afforestation is a big issue. And if you see the amazing inequities based simply on tree shade and air quality that exist in communities, almost always paralleling income and then diversity by color. And given that what we know about the climate change going to be increasing dramatically, not just the drought, but the overall average temperatures, and a couple of people raised this today, I think the commission may be well served to look a little bit and say, is there a true, what would I say, forestry type urban legacy program? And we'll come back to that in the subsequent discussions as well. The other quick point that I have is, I wrote it down with big emphasis. Here we go. Okay. Dean Hughes, let me also ask you, did I hear you correctly say that the same staff members are in charge of Sandy Point that do the Belt Woods? Is that what I heard?
Yes, sir.
Does anyone in the department know how far the Beltwood is from Sandy Point and the nature of the two facilities and things like that? That's a rhetorical question. I don't need you to answer that and get yourself in trouble, but that is of concern. I was a county executive when we got the Beltwoods with the cooperation of the state. And to think that that's the purpose of those two facilities are so diverse. And the other thing is, have you worked out what you would recommend to the commission? Did you submit this in your written? And I apologize, I haven't seen it yet. The question of wage scale differences, because you got the private sector, you got the local sector, you got the federal sector, and you got the state employees. Yeah, this is not terrible surprising that we're probably, the state is the lowest. But have you actually pulled that material together, or do you know someone that could, maybe even episodic the way you talked about a couple of parks? But we're really looking in an area, if you have a worker and they could work in the private sector, they could work in the public sector, which has other advantages to be sure, and then it's federal, state, or local, and where does that leave them?
Well, we'll be happy to help you develop a representative sample if you'd like. I know that very recently, Baltimore County Rec and Parks put out a recruitment for park rangers, and I know someone who actually, looked at this with interest and submitted an application because the compensation was roughly $10,000 higher than what the starting compensation is in the Park Service, in the State Park Service. So we'll be happy to collaborate with you and anyone to work on a list, at least a representative one, if you'd like us to.
Great.
And if you refer to our written testimony, there are some points on that you might find interesting.
Thank you very much. Let me also just conclude in this portion with an observation. I was pleased to see the several point reference to the Great America Outdoor Act. Not only because I personally, but working with Congressman Hoyer from Maryland, who was so significant in breaking that out as a separate vote and not getting it incorporated into the entire infrastructure. But most importantly, what that tells me is capturing the imagination is that it is a multi-year, big picture, big vision commitment to the federal parks. And just about everyone that I'm talking to is saying this is the most singular investment in our federal parkland since the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now, maybe this is an opportunity for us to think of the Great America Outdoor here in this. And the second thing that I like the reference that one of our presenters made about this being similar to the Kirwan Commission. And could we, in fact, have the same almost generational impact on our parks and open spaces that it is hoped that the Kirwan Commission will have on education, so that a decade from now, people look back and say, that commission made a difference. And I don't want to harp on that too much, but I do believe in what we've called this vision thing. I think there's real value to it. Senator, do you have a question?
Just one quick question, Governor. Well, thank you. While we have Mr. Hughes, you mentioned that we're losing staff. Are we losing, do you have any anecdotal evidence of where are we losing them to county park service? Are we losing them to national park service? Any anecdotal evidence of where we are losing them to? And are we surrounded by opportunities where they can make more money and greater benefits?
We lose people to county parks, especially Anne Arundel and Howard, Baltimore County. A lot of these metro county park agencies have much more competitive salaries. And also the private sector, our maintenance staff, who, as I said earlier, are unsung heroes when things are going as bad as they can go at Sandy Point because the restrooms just shut down, backed up, and sewage is flowing. Those are the people that we are so glad to see. It's our maintenance folks. And, frankly, in the private sector, they would be considered skilled tradesmen in many cases. They really keep our parks running smoothly, or at the minimum, they make sure that people can't tell that they're not running smoothly in some cases. So it's a combination of county agencies, the private sector, and any number of places.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Can I just add one quick thing to that about the turnover? A lot of times I've just found over the years that one problem kind of begets another, that of the issues we discussed with the pay issue and also the lack of staffing. And that just puts a lot more pressure on the remaining staff to basically just keep spinning plates, on their day-to-day job and the expectations. And people just will find greener pastures. And a lot of times it goes to the county parks and such, but a lot of times people say, like, this is just not worth it. And it requires an immense amount of commitment at times to be a park ranger, because it is something that every day you don't know, what you're going to be dealing with, and your plans are always being upended by circumstances in the park.
Chris, thank you for that comment. I would also add, by the way, the certain humorous thing when you say that on the comparison elsewhere and what it does. I recall a time when we were proposing a significant improvement in the state police salaries as well as in the retirement program. And one of the people sitting in the work group said, yes, but if you improve their salaries, others are going to want more improvement in their salary as well. And I actually thought that was kind of a interesting way to view this, keep everyone at a lower level because others might demand more. But given where our competition is, we're going to have to address that issue. We seriously will. Let me again thank everyone. The October 19th meeting will be focused somewhat on starting to sort out a little bit where we are and what the next steps are. Our staff has done a good job in terms of starting to organize that discussion just a little bit as well. I would also ask anyone viewing this, anyone participating, if you have written comments that you would like to submit, you see them posted, and the staff does a good job there of making sure that the commission sees those as well. Having said that, since we're 16 minutes over time, and I commend you all for keeping us in that time, let me ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
There was such a reluctance on this. I guess people were having a really good time and wanted to stay. I did hear for a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor? Great. Thank you all very much.